I have built many houses in this life, more than I can count with any honesty, if I am being precise about it, which is the only way a carpenter knows how to be. Frame houses and sod houses, stone foundations and clay floors, roofs that held for 40 years, and roofs that gave up their argument with the weather inside of one bad March. I have built barns and schoolhouses and a church with a bell tower that leaned 3 degrees south from the day we raised it, and leaned 3 degrees south still last time I rode past, which was more years ago than I care to calculate. I know what good construction sounds like. I know it the way a man knows a thing he has spent his whole working life inside of, not from books, not from principles written down somewhere, but from the particular sound a dry oak timber makes when it accepts a nail cleanly, and the different sound it makes when there is something wrong with the wood or wrong with the angle or wrong with the man swinging the hammer. I have made all those sounds. I have learned from most of them. But there is one structure I never built, never touched, never drove a single nail into, never set a single timber for, never offered a single opinion about, not while it was being built anyway, which is the part I have to live with. It was not the biggest thing I ever saw go up on the Nebraska plain. It was not the most complicated. By the standards of what I was doing in those years, it was modest work. Rough work even, the kind of work a trained carpenter looks at and sees the places where a trained carpenter would have done it differently. But it was the only structure I have thought about. In 50 years of this trade, every time the cold comes down from the north and the wind picks up, and the temperature starts its long fall toward the kind of numbers that make a man grateful for walls. I think about it because of what it did, and I think about it because of what I did not do in August of 1874, when I had the chance and the knowledge and the professional standing to say something, and chose instead to ride on. Her name was Maren Solberg. She was 34 years old. She had come from Norway with her husband Henrik 8 years before, and Henrik had died of yellow fever the summer of 1874, 6 months before this story really begins, and she had buried him on a Tuesday and filed her Homestead Act claim on a Thursday because there was nothing else to do, and the land office would not wait for grief to finish its business. I did not know her well. Harrow's Crossing was not a large town, 200 people, maybe 220 if you counted the families scattered on the claims outside, but it was large enough that you could know a person's name and circumstances without knowing the person. I knew she was Norwegian. I knew she was quiet in the particular way of someone translating their thoughts before releasing them, making sure each word was correct before committing to it. I knew her husband had been a steady man, well regarded, the kind of man whose absence you feel is a structural problem, the way you feel it when a load-bearing wall comes out of a house, and the whole thing shifts in ways that are hard to see but impossible to ignore. What I did not know, in the summer of 1874, was what she was planning to do with 160 acres of the worst ground in Custer County. Let me tell you something about Harrow's Crossing in 1874, because without it, the rest of this does not make the kind of sense it should. We were on the open plain, not near the plain, on it. Every direction you looked from the center of town, the land went flat and far and did not apologize for either. There were no trees to speak of, not the kind of trees a man can build with or burn with. The Missouri River Valley had trees, but that was 60 miles east, which meant 60 miles of wagon road and whatever the weather chose to do to you on the way there and back. A cord of firewood in Harrow's Crossing in 1874 cost 3 times what it cost in a town with timber, and it weighed the same and burned the same and was gone just as fast. The average family in our county burned 4 cords of wood across a Nebraska winter. The average family could afford, after everything else was accounted for, somewhere between 2.5 and 3. The gap between what you needed and what you could pay for was a problem every family in the county carried from November through March, and most of them carried it in the form of burning corn cobs when the wood ran short, and hay bricks after that, and whatever furniture they could do without after that. By February, in a hard year, you could tell which houses had given up their chairs first. This was not a crisis. It was a condition. It was simply how winter worked on the open plain, and the people of Harrow's Crossing had made their accommodation with it the way frontier people make their accommodations with the things they cannot change, steadily, without complaint, with a kind of practiced endurance that looks like toughness from the outside and feels, from the inside, mostly like arithmetic. You counted what you had. You calculated how long it needed to last. You rationed accordingly. You got through. That was the world Maren Solberg filed her claim into in July of 1874, 6 weeks after she put her husband in the ground. The northwest parcel was the last piece of unclaimed ground in our section when she filed. There are people who will tell you she took it because she arrived late. Her journey from Omaha had been delayed, something with the wagon, and by the time she reached the land office, the other families had already chosen. That may be true. It is also true that I watched her, in the 2 days between her arrival and her filing, walk the boundary of that northwest parcel twice. Slowly, with a soil auger and a measuring cord she had brought from somewhere, and a small notebook she wrote in at intervals, stopping to kneel and push the auger into the ground and study what came up, then writing something down and moving on. I saw this from the road. I was passing through on a job. I did not stop. I told myself she was simply doing what any sensible homesteader does before signing their name to a piece of ground. I have had 35 years to consider whether I told myself the truth. The northwest parcel was low ground, wetter than the rest of the section, and the soil was heavy with clay, the kind of clay that swells when it is wet and cracks when it dries and has broken the hearts of more optimistic farmers than I can count. The drainage was poor. A wet spring would pond water in the northwest corner for weeks. No one in Harrow's Crossing would have chosen it if there had been anything else to choose. Gerald Patton, who ran the general store and had been the informal keeper of the county's collective opinion for 12 years, heard about Maren's filing by the end of the week. He mentioned it to me when I came in for nails. "Widow Solberg's taken the northwest parcel," he said. He set the nails on the counter and looked at me over his glasses with the expression he reserved for things that confirmed what he already believed about the world. Clay soil, low drainage, no good for wheat, no good for corn. She'll spend 2 years fighting the ground and go back east. I asked if he'd spoken to her. "No need," he said. "The land tells you what it is." Gerald was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy, from this distance, to make him into something simpler than he was. He had been running that store for 12 years. He had watched families come in from the east with good intentions and bad information, and leave 2 years later with neither. He had extended credit that was never repaid. He had watched children get sick in houses that were not built for Nebraska winters, and he had attended funerals that did not need to happen. And he had formed his opinions in the way that an honest man forms them, from evidence accumulated slowly at considerable personal cost. In 1869, a family named Kirchner had built a sod house 3 miles north of town. They had dug it wrong. No drainage grade, no lime in the walls, the entrance facing north into the wind. The walls absorbed moisture all winter. The youngest Kirchner boy developed a cough in November and did not recover from it. Gerald helped carry the coffin in February. He was one of 6 men who did, and afterward he stood in the cold for a while and did not say anything. After that he had opinions about people who built into the earth. Those opinions had weight behind them that most people in Harrow's Crossing did not know about. They sounded like stubbornness. They were something closer to grief that had nowhere to go except forward, into the next winter, and the one after that. I knew about the Kirchner boy. I had helped build that house, in fact, which is another thing I have carried. When Gerald said the land tells you what it is, I understood what he meant by it, and I understood why he meant it, and I said nothing to complicate it. Maren Solberg had come into the store once in those weeks to buy a soil auger, a measuring cord, and a 20-pound sack of lime. No lumber, no nails, no axe. Gerald had told me about the purchase with the auger of a man reporting evidence. "What kind of house," he said, "uses no lumber?" It was a fair question. I had a possible answer. I kept it to myself. By the middle of August, she was on her land every day, and the word that moved through Harrow's Crossing about her was the word that frontier towns settle on when they cannot categorize a person's behavior and do not want to spend too long trying. Peculiar, they said. Grief does things to a person. I rode past her parcel on a Tuesday morning, the 15th of August, going out to a framing job 3 miles further on. The air was already warm, the sky that particular pale blue of a Nebraska August that has no clouds in it and no apology for the heat. I had my tools in the wagon bed and my mind on the job ahead of me. She was on her knees in the northwest corner of the parcel, beside a hole she had dug, 2 feet across, maybe 3 feet deep, from what I could see at the road. She was writing in her notebook. She did not look up. I slowed the horse. I am not sure why. Habit, maybe. A carpenter's instinct to look at construction, or the beginning of construction, or whatever this was. The hole was not random. There was a line of smaller holes extending south from it, evenly spaced, each one marked with a small stick. She had been measuring something across the length of that line. Temperature, I understood later. She was taking the temperature of the earth at different depths, morning after morning, tracking how the numbers changed and how they stayed the same. She had been doing it for 3 weeks. I looked at the line of holes. I looked at the auger laid in the grass beside her. I looked at the notebook. I thought about the lime she had bought and the measuring cord, and the south-facing slope of the ground in this particular corner of the parcel, and the clay content of this particular soil, and several other things that my 39 years of building in this country had given me the language to read. I understood, standing in the road on a Tuesday morning in August, what she was planning to build. I picked up the reins and drove on. I have thought about that moment more times than I am comfortable admitting to anyone, including myself. I have thought about it every winter since. I was thinking about it last week when someone at my table mentioned offhand that the last earth-sheltered house in this county had been torn down to make room for something modern, and nobody at that table knew where the design had come from, and nobody remembered the name Maren Solberg. I set down my coffee. This is what I should have said in August of 1874 on the road, with the reins in my hands and the full understanding in my head of what that woman was doing on her knees in the dirt of the worst piece of ground in Custer County. Let me say it now, 35 years late, and hope that late is better than never, though I have my doubts about that, and I expect I will carry them a while longer yet. There is a thing that happens to a person in the weeks after a significant loss that the living tend to misread. From the outside, it looks like distraction. The bereaved person moves through ordinary tasks slowly, incompletely, stopping in the middle of things for no visible reason. They stand at windows. They start sentences and do not finish them. They agree to conversations they are not having. The town of Harrow's Crossing read Maren Solberg this way through July and into August. She moved quietly through what needed doing. She filed her claim. She arranged her husband's remaining tools in the small rented room she was keeping above the feed merchant's storage. She ate her meals. She went to bed. She rose. What they did not see, what I did not see for longer than I should have, was that she was not distracted at all. She was paying attention, more attention, and to more things than anyone else in the county was paying to anything. I pieced this together afterward, over several years, from what Nora Voss told me, and from what Maren herself said on the few occasions she said anything about that summer. It does not come to me as a clean narrative. It comes the way most true things come, in pieces, with gaps, requiring a certain amount of honest assembly. What I know is this. In the first week after Henrik's burial, while she was still in town making arrangements, Maren began asking questions of a particular kind. Not the questions a grieving widow asks, not about prices or logistics or what a woman alone is supposed to do with 160 acres of unbroken Nebraska ground. She asked the questions a builder asks, except that she did not know she was asking them as a builder, and the people she asked did not know they were answering one. She asked the blacksmith, Otto Kraus, how deep the frost line ran in this county. He told her, with some puzzlement, that it varied. 3 feet in a mild winter, closer to 4 in a bad one. She wrote this in her notebook. She asked the woman who ran the boarding house, a widow herself, 20 years on the plain, whether the root vegetables kept longer in a corner cellar or a center one. The woman said center without hesitation. Marin wrote this down too. She asked Gerald Patton, when she came in for her supplies, whether the county had ever seen anyone build with compressed earth rather than sod. Gerald said he'd seen sod construction, plenty of it, and it was trouble waiting to happen. He did not elaborate. Marin thanked him and did not push. She was not collecting answers. She was collecting pieces of a question she had not yet fully formed. The question formed itself in stages, out on the northwest parcel, over the first 3 weeks of August. The land was flat, in the way that Nebraska land is flat. Not perfectly, not geometrically, but with the rolling almost flatness of ground that has been worked on by wind and water for a very long time, and has arrived at a kind of patient equilibrium. The northwest corner of her parcel dipped slightly, a gentle grade that would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it. Water moved toward this corner in a wet season. The soil here was the heaviest with clay. Most people would have seen this as the worst feature of already poor ground. Marin saw it and spent 4 days thinking about what it meant before she did anything else. What she did next is the part I have to reconstruct carefully, because I was not there, and Nora Voss was only there for pieces of it, and Marin herself was not in the habit of explaining her process to anyone who had not asked precisely the right question. But this is what I believe happened, assembled from what I know of the ground and what I know of how a particular kind of mind works when it is given enough quiet and enough necessity. She watched the prairie dogs. There was a colony of them on the eastern edge of her parcel, not large, maybe 30 or 40 animals, the kind of colony that had been in the same location for enough years that the mounds had settled and the entrance tunnels had been refined down to their most efficient angles. She had noticed them on her first walk of the property. She had not thought much of them then. She began watching them in the second week of August with the attention she had been giving everything else, careful, unhurried, recording what she saw. What she saw was this. The entrance tunnels were not random. Every one of them faced within a few degrees of south-southeast, angled slightly downward from horizontal. The mounds of excavated earth around each entrance were placed to the north, acting as windbreaks. The tunnels themselves dropped steeply for the first foot, then leveled off, then dropped again before reaching the living chambers. She could not see the living chambers, obviously, but she could measure the entrance angles. She could observe where the animals spent their time and what the temperature was when they chose to be above ground versus below it. She watched them through 6 mornings of varying weather, hot days, a cool spell, 1 morning of early rain. The animals' behavior changed with the surface temperature, but their tunnels did not. The tunnels were built for something constant, not something variable. They were built for the temperature underground. She dug her first test hole on August 10th. The test holes are the part I understand best, because they are the most mechanical part of what she did that summer, and mechanical things translate. She dug a series of them along a north-south line across the northwest corner of the parcel, 7 holes, evenly spaced, each one a different depth. The shallowest was 18 inches. The deepest was 54. She checked each one every morning at the same time, reaching her hand to the bottom and holding it against the soil at the base. Then, writing a number in her notebook that was not a precise temperature, she did not have an instrument calibrated for that, but was a recorded sensation: cold, cool, stable, warm, very warm. The thermometer came later. Henrik had carried it from Norway, a small brass instrument in a leather case, and she had kept it with his tools. By the 3rd week of August she was using it, lowering it on a string to the floor of each hole and recording the reading after 3 minutes. At 18 inches, the temperature tracked the surface air within a few degrees in either direction. Cool nights made it cooler. Hot afternoons made it warmer. At 36 inches, the tracking slowed. The soil remembered the previous day more than it responded to the current one. At 54 inches, the temperature was 53 degrees Fahrenheit on August 19th. It was 53 degrees on August 26th. It was 52 degrees on September 2nd, after a week in which the surface temperature had swung between 44 and 81. She wrote that number down and looked at it for a while. 52 degrees underground, while the world above shifted 40 degrees in either direction depending on what the sky decided to do. She had been asking, without knowing it, whether the earth could be trusted, whether it was stable enough, consistent enough to build a life against. The answer was in the numbers. The answer was yes. The design came to her not as an inspiration, but as a conclusion, which is a different and more durable thing. A conventional house sits on the ground and spends the winter arguing with everything above it. The wind, the cold, the radical temperature swings of a Nebraska plain where a January morning can be 40 degrees warmer than the January morning before it. The walls of a conventional house are 3 or 4 inches of wood, and 3 or 4 inches of wood is all that stands between the people inside and whatever the air outside has decided to become. You heat the inside, the outside steals the heat, you add more heat, and the winter is a sustained and expensive argument that the cold always wins eventually. But below 54 inches, the cold had never arrived. It had been trying for 10,000 years, and it had not gotten there. The earth held its temperature the way it held everything, slowly, patiently, across spans of time that made a Nebraska winter look like an afternoon. What if the walls were earth, not sod? She had heard what Gerald said about sod, and she had heard what she had not told Gerald she knew about the Kirchner family, which was that the problem with the Kirchner house had not been the material, but the method. The walls had been stacked, not compressed. They had been wet when they went up, and they had stayed wet. The lime had not been added. The drainage grade had not been cut. What if the walls were compressed earth treated with lime, 2 feet thick, set below grade so that the ground itself was the outer layer of insulation? What if the roof was 3 feet of living source seeded and rooted so that the house was not on the landscape but of it, a structure that the wind would pass over without finding purchase? What if you did not fight the winter? What if you simply went below it? She sketched the dimensions in her notebook on the 1st of September. 28 feet long, 16 wide, the floor set 4.5 feet below the surface. The south face open, a window to catch the low winter sun, an entry door facing southeast, away from the prevailing northwest wind. The back wall and both side walls bermed with earth to the roof line. The roof framed with whatever timber she could afford, not much, and covered with 3 layered courses of cut sod, the top course planted with native grass. She calculated the volume of earth she would need to excavate. She wrote the number down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote, in her careful, translated English, below the number, "Begin tomorrow. I will tell you what that excavation looked like from the road because that is where I saw it. A hole. A large, careful, perfectly rectangular hole in the earth with the excavated clay piled in an orderly berm to the north, placed there intentionally, she told Nora Voss later, because the berm itself would act as a windbreak for the entry approach. She was digging it by hand with a spade and a mattock, which I want you to sit with for a moment. 28 feet by 16 feet by 4.5 feet deep. That is just over 2,000 cubic feet of clay-heavy Nebraska soil, moved by one woman with hand tools. I have done the calculation many times over the years because it helps me understand what I was looking at from the road and failing to properly see. At the pace a person can reasonably work alone, and heavy clay does not move fast, that excavation would take between 3 and 4 weeks of full days. She had started on the 2nd of September. The first hard freeze in Harrow's Crossing typically came in the third week of November. She had 11 weeks. She was on the 8th day when I rode past. The first wall fell down. I did not see it. Nora Voss told me about it later because Nora had taken to cutting across the Solberg parcel on her way home from her father's eastern fields and had developed the habit of stopping to watch for a while before continuing on. She was 16 that year, with her father's German directness and her mother's eye for detail, and she watched Maren work the way a person watches something they are trying to understand and have not yet found the words for. The east wall went up on the 21st of September. Maren had framed it in wood, the only lumber in the structure, temporary forms to hold the earth while it compressed, and had begun packing the clay soil in layers, tamping each layer with a heavy flat stone before adding the next. The method was correct. The material was not yet ready. The clay was still too wet from a rain earlier in the week. The moisture content was too high to take the compression properly. The wall packed firm and held through the afternoon, and then, sometime in the night, the weight of the upper courses and the residual moisture made a decision together, and by morning the east wall had sheared and the forms had splayed outward, and 4 days of work was a pile of damp clay and split timber. Nora found her standing in front of it in the early morning. She said Maren stood there for a while, not a short while, looking at what had come down. Then she turned and looked at the sky and the ground, and something in that looking was not grief and not anger, but calculation. Nora said it was the most quiet she had ever seen a person be, and she had grown up in a quiet house. Maren did not rebuild the wall that day. She did not rebuild it the next day. She spent those 2 days digging out the fallen material and piling it separately, and cutting a shallow drainage grate into the base of the excavation on the east side, and waiting for the separated clay to dry. On the 3rd day, she mixed the dried and crumbled clay with lime at a ratio she had worked out in her notebook, 1 part lime to 8 parts soil, and began again. Nora watched her mix the first batch and asked what the lime did. Maren thought for a moment before answering, the translation pause, the search for the precise word. "It tells the clay," she said, "to stay where you put it." I know now that she was right about the lime in the way that an instinctive understanding is right, not completely, not with the full chemistry behind it, but right enough to matter. Lime reacts with the clay minerals in the soil and binds them differently, reduces the swelling and shrinking, stabilizes the matrix against moisture. When that wall went up the second time, it went up to stay. I examined it 11 years later, after she had given me permission to look at the construction up close, and the sections I could still see were harder than some stone I have worked with. They rang when you struck them. She lost 4 days to the first wall's failure. She did not, from everything Nora could observe, appear to consider the 4 days lost. She appeared to consider them, rather, part of the process of finding out what she was actually building, as opposed to what she had planned to build, which is never quite the same thing. That distinction between the building you intend and the building that teaches you what it needs to be is one I have spent a career thinking about. Most builders encounter it and call it setback. The better ones encounter it and call it information. Maren Solberg encountered it and called it nothing at all because she was already mixing the next batch of lime. There is a particular quality to a Nebraska October that people who have not lived through one tend to underestimate. They hear October and they think of the thing October is in gentler climates, the amber light, the turning leaves, the comfortable chill of a season settling into itself. They think of harvest suppers and the smell of wood smoke drifting pleasantly from a neighbor's chimney. They think of a world that is cooling down, yes, but doing so agreeably, at a civilized pace with adequate warning. Nebraska October is not that. Nebraska October is a negotiation that the sky wins. It can be 65 degrees and clear at noon and 28 degrees with horizontal sleet by 4 in the afternoon, and the transition between those two states will be announced by nothing more than a shift in the wind direction and a particular quality of light on the western horizon that you learn to read, after enough years on the plain, the way you learn to read a man's expression when he has already made up his mind and is simply waiting for the right moment to tell you. The sky on the Nebraska plain does not build toward winter. It arrives at it unevenly through a series of feints and withdrawals that keep you permanently off balance. 3 warm days that feel like a reprieve, then one night that reminds you what is coming, then 2 more warm days that are harder to trust than the cold night was. The experienced homesteaders of Harrow's Crossing did not relax in October. They accelerated. Every dry day was a working day. Every hour of usable light was a resource with a hard limit, and the limit was not negotiable and did not care about your schedule. Maren Solberg understood this. She had not spent a winter on the Nebraska plain, but she had spent winters in Norway, and while the specific arithmetic of the cold was different, the underlying principle was the same. The warm days were not gifts. They were the last of the working time, and they had to be used. She used them with a focus that I can only describe, at this distance, as total. By the first week of October, the walls were up. All 4 of them, the lime-stabilized rammed earth standing 2 feet thick and 4.5 feet tall above the excavated floor, which itself sat 4.5 feet below grade, so that the tops of the walls were at roughly ground level, and a person walking across the parcel from the north would see nothing but the berm she had raised and the beginning of the roof frame against the sky. The roof frame was the piece that cost her sleep, and I say that with the authority of a man who has lost his own sleep over roof frames and knows what that particular worry feels like at 3 in the morning. She had timber. Not much, the same limitation every builder on the open plain worked within, but enough for the structural members if she was careful. The span of 16 feet required a ridge beam stout enough to carry the weight of 3 courses of sod, which is not a trivial weight. Green sod runs heavy. Rooted sod, after a season of rain, runs heavier. She had done the arithmetic, and she had purchased the largest timber she could afford from Gerald Patton's yard. A single 12-foot pine log, rough cut, that she had transported to the parcel on a borrowed sledge and positioned for the ridge with a system of levers and rope anchors that Nora Voss described to me in detail many years later. I will tell you what Nora described, because the engineering of it matters. Maren dug 2 post holes at the center of the long walls facing each other, 4 feet in from the north and south ends. She set 2 upright timber posts in these holes packed with the lime-stabilized clay she now had in good supply, and braced each post diagonally with shorter members notched and pegged into place. Then she built a simple lifting frame, 2 A-shaped supports leaning toward each other over the length of the ridge, and ran her rope through a series of branch fork pulleys she had cut from the hardest scrub wood she could find on the parcel boundary. She raised the ridge beam in 3 stages over the course of a morning, walking the rope forward by hand, securing it, adjusting the A-frames, walking it forward again. Nora, who had arrived part way through and immediately understood that standing there watching was not the correct response, took the secondary rope without being asked, and managed the lateral tension on the east side while Maren worked the primary lift. The beam settled into its notches in the top of the 2 uprights at midday. Maren checked the level, a small brass instrument she had also kept from Henrik's tools, and then checked it again, and then did not check it a 3rd time because it was right, and she knew it was right, and checking a 3rd time is what you do when you don't trust your own work, which is a different problem than a level problem. Nora told me that when the beam was set, Maren stood back and looked at it for a moment. Then she said in Norwegian something that Nora did not understand. Nora asked what it meant. Maren thought about it. "It means," she said, "now it has a spine." The rafters went up over the next 4 days, and on the 5th day, the first course of sod went on. I want to explain what 3 courses of sod means for a roof, because it is the part of this construction that sounds excessive until you understand what it is doing. The first course, rough-cut blocks of Nebraska turf, grass side down, laid tightly against each other across the rafters, is structural fill. It covers the gaps, creates a continuous surface, begins the mass. The second course is laid perpendicular to the first, grass side still down, offsetting the joints. This is the same logic as brick coursing. You never want two joints lining up because that is where water finds its way and cold finds its argument. The third course is laid grass side up, positioned to take root, meant to knit itself together across one growing season into something that is no longer a collection of cut sod blocks, but a continuous living membrane across the entire roof. 3 courses, fully settled and rooted, run between 18 and 24 inches of earth and root mass across the span of the house. Add the air trapped in the grass layer and the thermal resistance of the earth itself, and what you have is an insulating system that laughs at a Nebraska January in the particular quiet way that things laugh when they do not have to raise their voice to make their point. What Maren was building, though she would not have used this language, was a structure that was thermally invisible to the winter. The cold would arrive at the surface, find 3 feet of rooted earth and 2 feet of compressed clay wall, and spend itself there without ever reaching the interior. The house would not fight the winter. It would simply decline to participate in it. The roof was finished on the 16th of October. She planted the 3rd course with the last of the native grass seed she had harvested from the parcel boundary in early September, another thing she had been doing while the rest of Harrow's Crossing was watching her and shaking their heads. She had spent 3 mornings in late August collecting seed from the grasses that grew on the highest, driest ground of the parcel, understanding, though no one had told her, that those were the varieties that would survive a rooftop winter and come back in the spring. 2 days after she finished the roof, the temperature dropped 40 degrees between noon and nightfall, and the first hard frost of the season came in from the north at 11 o'clock and stayed. She was inside when it arrived. I should tell you about the interior because it is the part people always wanted to know about later, and the part Maren was least willing to describe, as if the inside of the house was a private matter in a way the construction was not. What I know comes from the few people who were eventually inside it and from the measurements Nora Voss kept in her notebooks, which I was privileged to read some years later. The floor was the native soil of the excavation, packed hard and covered with a layer of the lime-clay mixture, smoothed flat and allowed to cure. It was cool underfoot in the way that a stone floor in a cellar is cool, not cold, not damp, simply at the temperature of the earth it was made from. Along the north wall, which was the wall with the most thermal mass behind it, 2 feet of compressed earth, then the full depth of the berm outside, Maren had built a sleeping bench of the same material as the walls, 18 inches high, packed solid and smooth. It was, in effect, a raised section of the earth itself. She covered it with her bedding, and it held what warmth there was and released it slowly through the night, the way a hearthstone holds the warmth of a fire long after the fire has died down. The south-facing window was 8 inches wide and 20 inches tall, set at a deliberate angle, not vertical but tilted slightly to catch the low arc of the winter sun rather than the high arc of the summer one. In January, when the sun runs close to the horizon, that window would throw a bar of direct light across the interior floor for 3 hours a day. 3 hours of direct winter sunlight on a packed earth floor is not a trivial amount of warmth. The floor would absorb it during the day and release it through the night, slowly, into the air of the sealed interior. She had one small iron stove, purchased second-hand from Gerald Patton's yard, 1/3 of a cord of firewood stacked against the east interior wall. The rest of the warmth, the majority of it across the majority of the winter, was going to come from the earth. The experiments she ran in October are the part I find most difficult to render fairly, because they are the part that looks, described plainly, like the actions of someone who does not trust what they have built, that is not what they were. They were the actions of someone who had built a hypothesis and now needed to know if the hypothesis was correct, because the cost of being wrong was not an inconvenience, but a winter alone on the open plain without adequate heat. She was not checking her work out of anxiety. She was checking it out of the same methodical necessity that had driven every other decision she had made since August. On the 18th of October, 2 days after the first hard frost, she placed 2 buckets of water, identical buckets, filled from the same source, at the same time in the early morning. One she set outside the south-facing entry, in the shade, out of the wind. One she set on the interior floor against the north wall. The outside bucket froze before noon. The inside bucket did not freeze for 11 more days. She had not lit the stove once. She recorded this in her notebook with the same handwriting she used for everything, even careful, each letter placed where she intended it. And she did not, from what Nora observed, appear particularly surprised. It was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. The distinction mattered to her. What she did next with that information is the thing I think about when I think about the kind of mind she had. She did not tell anyone. She did not go into town and report to Gerald Patton or Otto Kraus or any of the men who had formed their opinions about the Northwest parcel and its widow. She did not write letters or post notices or make any effort to communicate what her frozen and unfrozen buckets had established. She took the information and used it. She used it to calibrate her firewood rationing. Now she knew, with real numbers, how many degrees of warmth the earth itself would provide, and she could calculate backward to determine exactly how little supplemental heat she actually needed. She used it to decide when to move her 2 sheep and 4 hens into the animal chamber she had partitioned at the east end of the structure, a smaller room separated from the main interior by a timber-framed wall, where the animal's own body heat would add to the thermal mass and where the earth temperature alone would keep them above freezing through all but the most extreme cold. She moved the animals in on the 28th of October. She rationed her first cord calculation down to its final number. She would need to light the stove on perhaps 15 days across the full winter, and on those days she would burn no more than 2 small logs. 1/3 of a cord would be sufficient, with margin. Gerald Patton saw the wood pile delivered. It came out from town on a half-loaded supply wagon, and he said something to the driver about it, and the driver said something to the next person he spoke to, and by the end of the week the information had moved through Harrow's Crossing in the way that information moves through a small town, which is to say thoroughly and imprecisely. What reached me was this. Widow Solberg's put in her wood, 1/3 of a cord, barely enough to see her through October. I heard this, and I thought about the window angle and the sleeping bench and the 2 feet of compressed earth wall and the number 53 degrees underground in August, which I had not stopped thinking about since the morning on the road. I did not say anything. The sky in November went the color of worn pewter and stayed there, and the temperature began its descent in earnest, and the wind out of the northwest took on the quality it takes on in November on the open plain. Not stronger exactly, but more committed, as if it had made a decision and intended to see it through to March. In town, people stacked their wood piles and checked their draft seals and looked at the sky with the expression of people doing arithmetic they already know the answer to, but keep checking anyway. On the northwest parcel, 3 miles out, a thin thread of smoke rose from a ventilation shaft in what looked, from the road, like an unremarkable rise in the ground. It rose straight up in the still air of those first November mornings, thin, steady, unhurried. The smoke of a fire that was not needed for survival, only for comfort. The smoke of a house that already knew what the winter was going to do and had decided, quietly, months ago, that it would not be participating. I saw it once riding past on a gray November morning, the frost hard on the ground and my breath coming in clouds and my horse reluctant in the cold. I looked at that thread of smoke for a long time. Then I turned my collar up and rode on. The worst January in 30 years was 6 weeks away, and nobody in Harrow's Crossing knew it yet. Nobody except possibly a 34-year-old Norwegian widow who had spent the autumn reading the ground, and who had by November finished reading and begun to wait. The cold that came in January of 1875 did not arrive like a storm. That is the first thing I want you to understand about it, because the stories that got told afterward tended to dramatize it into something it was not: a wall of weather, a sudden catastrophe, the kind of event that announces itself with enough theater that a person feels justified in being caught unprepared. It was not that. It was simply cold, steady, committed, unremarkable cold that settled over the county on the 3rd of January and did not lift for 6 weeks. No blizzard, no drama. Just a temperature that dropped to 18 below zero and stayed there day after day, varying only enough to remind you that it was choosing to remain and was not doing so by accident. The sky was clear most of those weeks, a pale, hard blue that gave you the sun without giving you any of its warmth, so that you could stand in full January light on the Nebraska plain and cast a shadow and still lose feeling in your hands inside of 10 minutes. The wind ran at 20 miles per hour out of the northwest and did not rest. In a county where every family was already rationing firewood from the 1st of November, 6 weeks of 18 below is not a crisis that arrives. It is a crisis that accumulates day by day in the shrinking measurement of wood piles and the growing calculation of how many days remain until the supply wagons can make it through from the river valley, and whether those two numbers are going to resolve in your favor. For most of Harrow's Crossing, they did not. By the 2nd week of January, 3 families in the county had burned through their primary wood supply. They moved to corn cobs, which burn hot and fast and are gone before they have properly warmed the room. They moved to hay bricks after that. One family began taking apart the interior partition walls of their house, not the structural members, not yet, but the finishing lumber, the door frames, the window casings, feeding their own house to their stove in order to keep the house warm enough to survive in. The arithmetic of that, if you follow it to its end, is not an arithmetic with a good answer. Gerald Patton made 2 wagon runs to the river valley in the first 2 weeks of January. The first run brought back a full load at tripled prices. The second run, in the 3rd week, found the road in poor enough condition from the frozen ground heaving that he could only manage half a load, and the price had gone up again, and he came back with enough to see his own family through and little surplus to sell. He stood behind his counter in those weeks with the expression of a man who has run the numbers and does not like what they tell him, and he sold what he had at the lowest margin he could sustain, and he extended credit to 3 families he was not certain would ever repay it, because the alternative was to watch them burn their furniture, and Gerald Patton was not that kind of man, regardless of what other kinds of man he was. I want to say that clearly, because it matters to the accounting. Anders Voss came to Maren Solberg's door on the morning of January 18th. He had 3 piglets left from a litter of 7. The other 4 had died in the uninsulated corner of his barn during a night when the temperature dropped to 23 below, and the hay he had packed around their pen was not sufficient, and he had not known until morning. He had found them in the pale January dawn, and stood there in his barn for a while in the way that a man stands when he has lost something he could not afford to lose and is waiting for himself to finish understanding it. He had heard, through his daughter Nora, about the animal chamber, about the temperature Maren maintained without a stove, about the numbers in the notebook, which Nora had shared with him in November, reading them aloud at the kitchen table with the matter-of-fact certainty of a 16-year-old who has not yet learned to doubt what is plainly written in front of her. He had listened to those numbers in November and said nothing. He was his father's son, which meant he was a man who did not revise his position until the evidence had accumulated past a certain threshold, and in November the threshold had not been reached. In January, standing in his barn in the early morning with 4 dead piglets, the threshold was definitively behind him. He arrived at her door at 7 in the morning with his hat in his hand and the 3 surviving piglets in a crate on his wagon, and the specific expression of a man who has decided to do something difficult and has decided to do it without making it into more than it is. He said, "Mrs. Solberg, I have heard your animal room stays above freezing. I would like to pay for the use of it." Maren opened the door wider. "Bring them in," she said. What Anders saw inside is the part I have reconstructed most carefully over the years, because he described it to me in detail the following spring, with the precision of a man who had gone over the memory many times and wanted to get it exactly right. He saw a room that was not warm. He understood that immediately. It was not warm in the way a well-heated house is warm, with the active heat of a working stove pressing against your face when you enter. It was something different from that, and it took him a moment to identify what the difference was. It was stable. The interior of Maren's house was 51 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 18th, when the exterior temperature was 19 below zero. That is a difference of 70 degrees between the inside and the outside of a structure that had not burned a fire in 4 days. Anders had no instrument to measure this. He had his body, which had just come in from 19 below, and his body told him what the thermometer would have confirmed. He put his hand on the north wall. It was cool. Not cold, cool, the specific coolness of the earth at depth, the temperature the test holes had recorded in August. The wall was not stealing heat from the room. It was lending it. He stood there with his hand on that wall for what he told me was a long time. Then he said, "How long has it been like this?" Maren said, "Since I finished the walls." He looked at the single lamp burning on the table. He looked at the small iron stove, cold, the firewood stacked beside it untouched for 4 days. He looked at the south-facing window, throwing its bar of pale winter light across the packed earth floor. He looked at all of it with the eyes of a man remeasuring something he thought he had already measured. Then he brought the piglets in and paid Maren the rate she named without negotiating it, and went home and told Nora what he had seen. The others came across the following 10 days, one by one, in the order that necessity rather than inclination dictated. A family named Gruber, whose well casing had cracked in the freeze and left them without water, came on the 21st. Maren had 12 gallons stored in the cellar chamber where the earth temperature kept it liquid through the coldest nights. She shared it without ceremony, charging them nothing, which the Grubers found more difficult to accept than a charge would have been. 2 families came together on the 23rd, sent quietly by Ruth Patton, who had made up her mind about something in November and had been waiting for the right moment to act on it, and had decided, sometime in the 3rd week of January, that the right moment was now regardless of whether she had asked permission. She had not asked Maren's permission. She had simply told the 2 families, one of which had children, which Ruth considered a determining factor, where to go and what to ask for. Maren accepted this without comment on Ruth Patton's method. She made room. Gerald came last. He arrived on the afternoon of January 23rd with his 2 milk cows on a lead behind the wagon. He did not look at Maren when he drove up. He looked at his cows and at the ground, and then at a point somewhere between the 2. He climbed down from the wagon and said, in the voice of a man delivering a report he would rather not be delivering, "I would be grateful." Maren said, "There is room." He brought the cows into the animal chamber and settled them and came back out and stood for a moment in the main room of the house. Ruth had come with him. She walked through the interior slowly, the way she had walked through it in her imagination since October, her hand trailing along the north wall, her eyes moving across the window angle and the sleeping bench and the cold stove with its untouched firewood. She stopped at the thermometer on the interior wall. Henrik's thermometer, in its leather case, mounted now on a peg near the north wall where Maren checked it each morning. 52 degrees, January 23rd. No fire in 5 days. Ruth looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to Maren and asked if she would like a pot of soup brought over. It was not a large question. It was not meant to carry everything it carried. But on the frontier, the question a woman asks when she has been wrong about something and cannot quite say so directly is usually a practical question about food, and Marin understood this and said that she would. I came on the 24th. I had no livestock to shelter. I had no practical reason to be there. I came because I had run out of reasons not to, which is a poor reason to do the right thing, but is sometimes the reason available to you. I stood in that room and I looked at every decision she had made: the wall thickness, the roof angle, the window placement, the ventilation shaft with its wooden damper set at the precise aperture to allow air exchange without significant heat loss. I looked at all of it with 50 years of carpentry behind my eyes, and I understood, joint by joint and course by course, what I was looking at. It was not the work of a trained builder. The joints were not perfect. There were places where I would have done it differently, where a more experienced hand would have found a better solution. But the logic underneath it, the structural logic, the thermal logic, the understanding of how the materials would behave across time and temperature, that logic was sound in the way that only sound things are sound, which is to say it was still standing in January and would still be standing in 30 years, and the people inside it were warm. I stood there for a while without speaking, which is what I do when I am thinking through something I should have thought through sooner. Then I said, "I saw this in August. I should have said something." Marin looked at me with the steady patience of a woman who had already worked out every implication of that statement and had no particular need for me to work through it aloud. She said, "Yes, you should have." That was all either of us said about it. I have replayed those two sentences many times. I have not found anything missing from them. Gerald Patton went to the county land office on the 27th of January and filed a formal notice contesting the quality assessment on the northwest parcel. His argument was not sentimental. He wrote in his careful merchant's hand that the parcel had been incorrectly graded as non-arable, based on surface soil characteristics that did not account for the demonstrated thermal and structural properties of the subsoil, and that the Homestead Act improvement timeline should be recalculated accordingly, and that the current tax assessment was therefore in error. He sent Marin a copy of the filing. He did not include a letter. I asked him about it the following spring. He said the assessment had been wrong, and it bothered him to have wrong numbers in the county record. I believe that was true. I also believe there was a morning in late January when he stood in his store in the cold and calculated the difference between what his woodpile had cost him and what Marin's had cost her, and something in that calculation settled a question he had been carrying since the Kirchner boy's funeral in February of 1869. I did not ask him about that. Some accountings are private. The cold broke in the second week of February. The temperature rose 20 degrees in a single afternoon, and the wind shifted south, and the snow that had crusted on the ground began to loosen at its edges, and the county of Harrow's Crossing came out of its houses and stood in the thin February sun and breathed the changed air with the specific relief of people who have gotten through something they were not entirely certain they would get through. By the following winter, 3 families in the county had broken ground on earth-sheltered structures. By the winter after that, 4 more. They came to Marin with questions, not all of them, and not easily, and not with the word sorry attached to any of it, because the frontier does not traffic much in that word. They came with technical questions, which is the frontier's native language for the things it cannot say directly. Otto Kraus, the blacksmith, came in March with a piece of paper and asked about the ventilation shaft dimensions. A farmer from the northern section asked about the lime ratio in the wall mixture. Anders Voss spent 3 Saturdays in April extending the animal chamber, bringing his own tools and his own labor and calling it neighboring, which is what it was. Nora Voss kept her temperature notebooks for 4 more years. They became, eventually, the most precise climate record in the county, though no one knew that yet. She put Marin's name at the top of every page. By the winter of 1877, nobody in Harrow's Crossing called the design anything in particular. They called it building smart for this ground. They called it the county way. They had handled the idea enough times, passed it between enough hands, adapted it to enough different parcels and soil conditions that it had lost the specific fingerprints of the northwest parcel and the woman who had spent the autumn of 1874 on her knees in the dirt, reading what the ground was trying to tell her. I thought about this for a long time before I decided how to feel about it. What I arrived at, after enough winters, was this. On the frontier, when an idea stops belonging to the person who found it and starts belonging to everyone who needs it, that is not ingratitude. That is the highest form of adoption. That is the idea surviving, which is the only thing that matters more than the idea being credited. Maren Solberg lived on that land for 31 more years. She did not leave the county. She did not remarry. She improved the parcel steadily, a proper wood floor in the 3rd year, a greenhouse addition in the 5th, using the south-facing wall of the house as its thermal anchor, extending her growing season by 6 weeks in either direction. She attended the spring social and the harvest gathering every year, and she listened more than she spoke, and the people of Harrow's Crossing gradually stopped finding this strange. I attended her funeral in 1906. The church could not hold the people who came. I set down my coffee last week when someone at this table said they had torn down the last earth house in the county. It had gone cold while I was talking, which is what happens when you start telling a story you have been holding for 35 years. The cold coffee, the lamp burning lower than I had noticed, the particular quality of the silence in this room when I finished. I have been a carpenter for 50 years. I know good construction when I see it. I saw it on a Tuesday morning in August of 1874 from the road, with the reins in my hands and a full day's work ahead of me, and every reason to keep moving and no reason, beyond the plain and uncomfortable fact of what I understood, to stop. I did not stop. She built it anyway. It stood anyway. It kept people warm who had not deserved her warmth, and she gave it without making them say so, because the work was not about deserving. The work was never about deserving. It was about what the ground could do if you took the time to ask it the right questions and listened, really listened, to what it said back. The last earth house in this county came down last week. Somebody built something modern in its place. I suppose that is progress. I suppose Maren Solberg would have looked at it once, asked one question, and gone back to whatever she was building. The ground is still there. It still holds its temperature below 4 feet. It still remembers summer when everything above it has forgotten. It is patient in the way that only very old things are patient, without effort, without expectation, without any particular interest in whether we are paying attention. It waited for her. It is waiting still.